night shootout. My friends and I were staying at an established campsite located inside a state park. So, technically, this isn't actually a deep woods camping story. But it was definitely intense and incredibly terrifying to experience. Sometime in the early AM, while it was still dark, probably between 1 and 2 AM or so, I and two of my tent mates were startled out of a deep sleep by distant gunfire. All of us were in disbelief and gave frantic, darting looks back and forth to each other for a few seconds before realizing that we needed to do something. After all, we couldn't just stay in our tent and wait around for a stray bullet to end one of us. So, we scrambled around our campsite and tried to pack up as much as we could, all the while staying as low as possible. Over the course of a half hour or so, the gunshots got even closer to our camp. At first, the gunshots were definitely a ways away, but during that half hour, we started hearing ricochets and small debris like chips of tree bark falling into the dry leaves on the ground only about 100 yards away from our campsite. The state park we were camping in doesn't allow hunting day or night, so we thought it was either someone ignoring the law or some crazy SOB walking around shooting at random. None of us had any weapons aside from our survival or camping knives, which obviously wouldn't help us against an active shooter in the middle of the night. Either way, not something any of us wanted to be dealing with. All of a sudden, we noticed some flashing lights that looked like spotlights or flashlights walking around at the bottom of the ridge, located around 300 yards below from where our campsite was located. At the bottom of the ridge was where the access road for the campsite ran through, and our campsite was just above a small valley between the road and one of the large mountains in the park. Eventually, those lights made their way closer to our camp. We could see them shining right over the tops of our tents. And it was just then that we realized there was a second shooter. We could clearly hear gunfire going off in two distinct directions. Just after this, we heard a helicopter and saw a giant spotlight shining down into the woods near our location. It was about 2 minutes after the helicopter showed up that we saw red and blue police lights moving quickly down on the road just below and heard additional gunfire. Then we heard shouting and a police officer yell, "Drop the weapons." Bang, bang. I said, "Drop the weapons." Bang. For a split second, everything went silent, and then we heard the sounds of scrambling and more frantic instructions being shouted through a bullhorn. This lasted for about another 2 minutes. The helicopter went away, and eventually all the sirens and everything went away. Then everything was quiet again. This left us all in shock, awash in adrenaline, and sweating profusely. After a few more minutes, we realized that about half our campsite was packed up. But with everything seemingly over, we decided to stay. The rest of the night was stressful, at least for me. I didn't really get any rest after that. I slept in my clothes and held my survival knife under my pillow until daybreak. After everyone woke up the next morning, we packed up the rest of our camp and decided to head to the campsite office to inquire about what happened the night before. As we were walking out of the campsite, it was obvious just how dangerous the situation last night had become. There were bullet holes in trees all around our camp. None of us had realized just how close we came to getting taken out. The camp manager told us that two of the local residents who lived on property just adjacent to the national park had done some drugs the night before and thought it would be funny to shoot at cars driving through the access road to the campsite. Luckily for us, the state police were called, and obviously they managed to arrest them. The manager asked if anyone in our party was hurt. Unfortunately, we were able to say no. He apologized to us for the commotion and asked if there was anything else we needed. We said no, and that we just wanted to get home. As we drove out of the park, I noticed some bullet holes in one of the RVs that was parked near the campsite entrance. I pointed it out to my friends, and I was met with silence. As intense as the situation was, fortunately nobody was killed. I still go camping, but I find myself being much more aware of any noises or sounds I hear on the outskirts of where I'm camping. Needless to say, this is one camping trip I will never forget. Number 2. My partner and I were deep in Mount Adams Wilderness area, located in Washington State, the U.S., and there were no other campers around. We had spent the day fishing and exploring the creek around our camp. Around 2 a.m., he wakes me up and tells me to be quiet. Our little dog is quietly growling and looking in one direction. About 15 yards north of the tent, I can hear rustling and a woman's voice speaking quietly to herself. Couldn't discern any of the words. There is no light, just the voice and the walking noise. It goes quiet, and then picks back up on the other side of the tent, which is even deeper woods. Then it faded off into the dense forest. My partner had literally grabbed his gun and was getting ready to confront them, but since it seemed to move on, nothing ever came of it. I cannot stress enough how deep these woods were. We had explored the day before, and I had scratches from twigs and branches. It was so dense. The fact that there was someone alone, wandering around talking to themselves in the middle of the night, without a light or camp, is so freaky. And I still get chills whenever I think about it. The next morning, we investigated and didn't find any tracks. But there was a really haphazardly lit fire. Charred remains in the middle of the forest, logging road about a mile up. It was still kind of warm. I know there's a small town of about 150 people, about 10 miles south from where we were camped. So, maybe it was a drunk teenager. We were almost touching the Yakima Indian Reservation also, and the logging roads were still actively used, but still so bizarre. Number 3. 10 years ago, when I was a skinny little 17-year-old, I was hiking the rural side of a levee with a friend who was even scrawnier than I was. It was a long, long walk into the woods, and for about an hour or more, we hadn't seen anyone else. Just trees and foliage. We finally stumbled upon a huge, nest-looking area. It was so random and out of place, so we investigated. There was paper and cloth everywhere, torn magazine pages, old clothes, cans, everything piled into one huge mess. We assumed maybe people drove their truck out here and dumped their trash. So we just turned to leave. But in that very moment, we saw a tall, rugged man wearing all black, staring right at us. He was maybe 6'3", had shaggy, unkempt hair, and looked dirty and disturbed. He stood about 15 feet away, and he was just staring, and completely silent. My friend didn't say anything, so I said, "Hi, do you live here? Is this your stuff?" And he only nodded yes, and then we slowly backed away and left. He just stared at us until we could no longer see him anymore. And then we picked up speed to get back to civilization. Every so often I think back to this event and how lucky we were. We were so far out, if we had screamed, no one would have heard us, and no one would have came to our aid. If this man decided to attack us, it would have been over. So, even though nothing happened, it still makes my blood run cold when I think about it. Number 4. I consider myself an outdoorsy kind of person. I love hiking, exploring, and even camping. I love just walking around in nature, taking in the sounds and the smells, feeling like I'm one with nature. But the following story is one of the most terrifying experiences I ever had while out in the woods. This happened at the end of June, about 10 years ago. 2 of my friends and I were walking along a section of the Appalachian Trail when we happened across a bundle of sticks just sitting in the middle of the path. But not just any pile of sticks. These sticks were arranged into a little figurine. Something very similar to what you've seen in the Blair Witch Project, for example. And because it was directly in the middle of the path, I doubted that it was something that somebody just dropped. It looked like it had been deliberately placed there. For what reason, I don't know. But when I saw it, it piqued my interest. So I went over to it, looked at it intently, admired its construction, and then decided to place it in my bag. Now, this should have freaked me out, but for some reason it didn't. My 2 friends asked me what it was. I told them it was just a little figurine. I didn't even show it to them, as I recall. They didn't even seem that interested. They were more interested in going ahead and finding a good campsite. So like I said, I placed it in my bag, and I pretty much forgot about it. We spent the next couple hours searching for a good campsite. When we finally found it, we all got to work quickly and set up camp. We were all tired from the long day of hiking, so after we set up, we ate dinner, and then we all retired into our separate tents and fell asleep. Nothing particularly eventful happened that night. I actually slept all the way through the night. The next morning I was the first one up, so I decided to make some tea. I unzipped my tent and took a deep breath of the cool morning air. I felt invigorated and was looking forward to another pleasant day of hiking. But as I made my way to our fire pit, it was my optimism about the day that was snuffed out. What was it that caused this dramatic change in my mood? Well, sitting right on top of the pile of charred wood from the previous night's fire was a bundle of sticks, identical to the one I had found on the path the night before. I couldn't believe my eyes. It looked exactly the same. There it was, just sitting there, an identical little figurine. At first I thought one of my friends was trying to play a sick joke, so I ran back into my tent and looked in my bag to see if it was still there. And when I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. There it was, still in my bag, untouched. I quickly ran back to the fire pit with the original figurine in hand, picked up the new one, and compared them. They were, in fact, identical. In fact, it was obvious they were made by the same hand. It was at this moment that my heart started to race, and the fear that I should have felt when I found the figurine at first suddenly washed over me. I started scanning the perimeter of our camp, looking deep into the woods in every direction, looking for something, but hoping I wouldn't see anything. As it turns out, I didn't. Nothing looked disturbed. I didn't see any shadow figures or anything at all. I didn't even hear anything, except for some birds and the wind through the trees. By every objective standard, it was a perfectly calm morning. I started to look on the ground around our campsite to see if there were any signs of an intruder, but there was nothing. I couldn't understand how this thing got in the middle of our fire pit in the middle of the night. I certainly didn't hear anything. Nothing woke me up. So how on earth did this thing get there? The only thing left to do is to wait for my friends to wake up, ask them, and hope that it was one of them deciding to play a joke. Well, shortly after this, both of my friends emerged from their tents, and I confronted them in a rather indignant manner. I pushed the dolls into their hands and said, "Which one of you did this?" They looked at me with confused faces and asked what I was talking about. I pointed to the new one and said, "I found this in the fire pit. Which one of you put it there?" They both became a little angry and said, "We didn't do it." In fact, one of my friends pointed out that the figurines are identical, but that I hadn't showed them the figurine, so how could they have made one that was identical if they didn't see it? It was then that both of them started to look scared. Then one of them accused me of being the one trying to play a prank. I asked them if they had heard anything during the night, and they both said no. So we were at a loss to explain it. Eventually, we let it go. We quickly ate breakfast, packed up our camp, and headed out into the woods again to finish our hike. Nothing else eventful happened, and I should say for the record that I left both dolls in the middle of our campsite as we left. I didn't want to have anything to do with those things after that. During the rest of our trip, I kept thinking about it, though. I kept trying to figure out, or rather convince myself, that one of my friends was trying to just play a trick on me. We were out in the middle of nowhere, so it's not like one of them could have put it in the middle of the path ahead of time. So even though it's very unlikely that it was a prank, I'd still rather believe that. But deep down I know that's probably not the case. It's just that believing it was a prank is far less terrifying than the alternative. Number 5. I was somewhere in the middle of the White Mountains in the summer a few years ago when I walked into what looked like a scene from a horror movie. A person with zero hiking, camping, or other experience had gotten themselves into a bit of trouble. Big trouble. It was around 7 or 8 a.m. when I found the campsite. The first thing that hit me was the eerie stillness, until I noticed the shredded tent under a tree and a desperate-looking human figure covered in blood and whimpering quietly. I immediately put my bag down, grabbed my kit, and went over to the person laying down. They looked like they had just lost a knife fight with a four-armed man. There were deep slashes from one shoulder to their hip, single punctures up and down his back, and his hands and forearms were full of what looked like defensive cuts and wounds. I patched him up to the best of my ability, gave him some water, and then checked my map and quickly went to the closest road. This was before cell phones were super prevalent, and they barely worked in the mountains anyway. But thankfully, the road was very close by, less than 2 miles, and fortunately I was able to flag someone down. They took off, and I waited for assistance to arrive. It took about an hour until the rescue team arrived, and I led them to the still unidentified individual. He wasn't very talkative while I was helping him out, and I was sure he'd be dead before we arrived, but I was wrong. I assisted the rescue team bringing him out, and took them up on their offer to head into town and get cleaned up. After cleaning up and getting myself situated at their station, I went on my way. I left them with my number to call me to let me know what was up with the person we helped out. I got home about 3 days later, and there was a message on my machine. As it turns out, the story was that the guy I found decided to go camping one day and heard that he had to keep food hung from a high tree to keep bears away. Well, he did that, but put it almost directly over his tent. But unfortunately, not nearly high enough. The night before, I just happened to find him. A bear had used the tent and its occupant in an attempt to climb the tree to get to the food. I can't even imagine what it must have been like for this guy. Going to bed, enjoying yourself, and then to be woken up by 4 black bear paws sinking into your body as it's shifting and moving and digging into your skin with its claws. But he survived and swore to the hospital staff that he was, quote, moving to the city and was never going into the woods again. Truthfully, I can't blame him. But it just goes to show you that it's better to be safe. Please, know what you're doing before you go out, especially if you're planning on camping alone. Always remember, nature is beautiful, but it can also be very deadly.